Hello again. I'm Adam, this is Retro Replay, and it's time for the final part of my look at the Atari Flashback Classics collection. Now, my calling this the final part is tentative. It is possible that Atari can put out a Volume 4 at any point, and I'd want to keep an opening in case that happens. Like with the last two videos, I'm going to blast through the 50 games in this volume. However, there are a couple major differences this time around. First is the type of games featured. In the first two volumes, there were 9 arcade games and 41 2600 games, a couple of which never got official releases back in the day. This time, there are 14 arcade games, with the rest spread among 2600 games, including prototypes, fan games, and stuff from M networks, basically in television ports, and 5200 games. That's a treat, since finding an actual Atari 5200 with working controllers, especially the working controllers, is nothing less than a miracle. The second is that there are more multiplayer-only games this time around. The first two volumes had a couple of those, like Football and Combat, not enough to hurt those packages. A couple multiplayer games like Maze Craze were totally possible to play alone. This time, there are just too many that require 2 or more players. Each one I come upon in Volume 3 will be an automatic pass. Also, like before, any games that use paddles, dials, trackballs, or in this case the analog 5200 joysticks, can have some controller issues here. I've gotten the best results keeping the sensitivity at 2, but results may vary. Well, let's get started. Avalanche. This is basically an arcade take on Activision's classic game Kaboom, and it works well. It's actually a neat idea to reduce the number of paddles you have as you get closer to clearing the board. If you like Kaboom, try this one. Baseball. A very no-frills baseball game. Fielding is problematic. I found it difficult to get the right fielder to go for the ball. Also, as this originally released on one of those tabletop arcade units, it gets disorienting when the picture flips upside down each inning. Really, Atari just couldn't get baseball right in the early 80s. This is the closest they'd come, but I still don't recommend it. Basketball. This is the arcade version of the game of one-on-one I covered all the way back in Volume 1. The graphics are monochrome but detailed for the time, and the controls are a little looser than the 2600 version. Still enjoyed it though. Canyon Bomber. This is the arcade version of the 2600 game with sharper graphics, no color, and fewer options. I wasn't impressed by the 2600 version in Part 1, and the coin-op didn't change my mind. Destroyer. This is the coin-op version of the bombing modes that are in the 2600 version of Canyon Bomber. I hope I'm not confusing you. Controlling where the depth charges detonate makes the game more engaging than Canyon Bomber, and the artwork is very impressive at the time. I was surprised myself at how long I found myself playing it. Dominoes. This arcade game released on the 2600 as Surround. Like before, its concept is similar to the Light Cycles mode in the Tron arcade game, and it plays just as well as the 2600 game. It's a nice touch that each fail results in the line of dominoes being knocked over. Fire Truck. This is a co-op overhead racing game where, obviously, you're driving a fire engine. While the game can be played alone, it's not recommended as controlling the truck is extremely finicky. It's very easy to lose control of the rear end and crash into everything. This one is pure aggravation. Football. Maze Invaders. You control a blob navigating mazes to collect fruit and dodge obstacles. The graphics are colorful and pleasant, and there's a wide variety of mazes to get through. The issue is the controls are extremely slippery. The game originally used a trackball, which makes no sense since a joystick would have been preferable even at the time. Still, it's fun enough to play a few times. Monte Carlo. This is a top-down racing game similar to Fire Truck. The exceptions are that this game is in color, there are multiple tracks to race, and the controls don't suck shit. This one's worth a few laps. Pool Shark. This game barely resembles Pool. Your goal is to clear each rack in a very short amount of time, with the time cutting off if you scratch. Controls are extremely slippery, and the physics drove me nuts. If a ball doesn't hit a pocket dead center, it bounces off a cushion, and there's no technique at all. Go anywhere else for Pool. Like Pool Paradise, a game I'll definitely get to someday. Skydiver. It's a nicer looking version of the 2600 game I played in Volume 2. Played is in quotes because I had little control over my skydivers there, and the arcade version provides even less control as well as fewer chances. Talk about missing the target. Soccer. Superbug. This top-down racing game was rather ambitious for its time. It's an open racing game with several points where the course diverges, allowing for multiple routes. That was a neat idea. Fortunately, the controls match Monte Carlo and not Fire Truck. Go ahead and start this one up. Adventure 2. This game expands on the ideas presented in the original Adventure quite nicely. There are multiple kingdoms to explore, and the mazes get outright devious. There's a trophy for beating the game without dying. Considering how tough it is to find the chalice this time, all I can say is, good luck. Air Raiders. On the surface, this dogfighter resembles Radar Lock from Volume 1. However, this one is a bit more of a headache. It takes very little to kill you, and landing is required to refuel and rearm. Controls are very cumbersome with the fire button controlling the throttle and the weapons. This one should have stayed on the Intellivision. Aquaventure. This prototype is both enjoyable and infuriating at the same time. Your goal is to dive to the bottom of the ocean to retrieve treasures and return to the surface. The sea life that needs to be dodged has no clear movement patterns. It's very easy to die while shooting them, and every level adds an additional screen to dive to reach the treasure. While the game pissed me off plenty, I still wanted to try again. Armor Ambush. Asteroids. The 5200 version of this absolute classic is both better and worse than the arcade and 2600 versions. While the titular rocks look nicer and there are some new effects, the visuals are a bit drab compared to the more colorful 2600 version. The gameplay is tougher though, which is a plus for me. Astroblast. From one set of space rocks to another. Astroblast is like Asteroids and Space Invaders in one combo. The controls are much more slippery than the original Intellivision version, and the fact that this one plays faster doesn't really help. This one was a real disappointment. Centipede. The 5200 version sits between the arcade and 2600 versions of the game. The graphics are almost as good as the arcade, albeit stretched to fit a 4:3 screen, and the controls are tighter than the arcade version, but not as tight as the 2600 version. Still, it is an excellent take on the classic game. Certainly better than the version on Dreamcast, that's for damn sure. Countermeasure. Fortunately, not all the 5200 games in this collection are just prettier 2600 games. This tank battle game reminds me of Atari Warriors, with the independent movement and aiming controls. Unfortunately, the aiming desperately needed a twin-stick setup. Aiming the tank turret is a headache. Also, good luck figuring out the codes needed to stop the missile detonations between stages. This would have been a cool game if the annoying controls didn't get in the way. Dark Cavern. This Intellivision port is a simple shooter where you run around a maze, blasting aliens and robots. The atmosphere is impressive for the time, and the tension increases as you have to scrounge for ammo. This one still works. Final Legacy. This early strategy shooter hybrid has a bit of a steep learning curve when it comes to navigating the world map. However, the variety of shooter segments is very engaging, if tough. It takes a bit of time to get into it, but it's one of the most rewarding games in the whole Atari Flashback Classic collection. Frog Pond. This prototype 2600 game sees you controlling a frog and catching bugs. The graphics are pleasant for the time, and there's a decent variety of bugs with different movement patterns. The controls could be tightened a little. It can be very easy to miss bugs that are right over your head. However, I had fun with this one. Frogs and Flies. This one has the same concept as Frog Pond, but done in a slightly different way. There's more of a competitive angle here with you and your opponent hopping back and forth between two lily pads to catch dinner. The way time is kept by the game gradually getting darker is a nice touch. With this, Frog Pond, and Frogger, the 80s clearly knew how to make playing as a frog fun. Holy moly! It's whack-a-mole using the 2600 keypad. Leaving aside the fact that the keypad integration for this game is problematic, playing this on a 2600 isn't nearly as fun as going to Chuck E. Cheese and playing the real thing. What can I say? Sometimes digital replicas just aren't good enough. International Soccer. Microgammon. Remember in part 1 how I gave a thumbs up to Backgammon for the 2600 since it replicated the board game well enough? I can't do the same for the 5200 version. The visuals are monochrome and boring, and the controls are very unintuitive. I know Atari wanted to make use of the keypads on the 5200 controllers, but what was wrong with just using the stick and fire buttons here? Millipede. I've already said how Millipede is far superior to Centipede in every way for the arcade and 2600. However, the 5200 version runs too slowly, making the game way too easy. It's still fun, and can be a great option if you found the other games too troublesome. Miniature Golf. Just looking at the complexity of the courses and the large color palette, it can be very easy to say the 5200 version of Miniature Golf is far superior to its 2600 counterpart. However, like with Microgammon, the game goes out of bounds thanks to controls that are needlessly cumbersome. Even if Atari was dead set on using the keypad for shot strength, what was wrong with aiming with the stick? You think Atari knew at the time the 5200 joysticks sucked? Missile Command. It's an almost perfect melding of the graphics of the arcade version and the playability of the 2600 version. This version of Missile Command is easily one of the 5200's best games. Moto Rodeo. This driving game plays like a prototype of Excite Bike. The graphics are rather simplistic for one of the last official 2600 releases, and the controls lag like crazy. Trying to score the big point bonuses is very annoying. Don't get me started on trying to use the springs. Just stick to Excite Bike. Real Sports Baseball. I won't deny that the 5200 version of this is the best baseball game Atari put out. The graphics and sound are top tier for the system. However, the port in this collection fails due to its controls. Choosing pitches is a headache, and fielding is a lot of trouble. While basketball was well represented in this collection, and even football got at least one decent game, absolutely none of the baseball games in this entire collection are worth your time. Real Sports Basketball. It's a much prettier game of one-on-one than the arcade or 2600 games. The shooting mechanics are a little touchier, but I still had fun with it just like the others. Real Sports Football. Real Sports Soccer. Soccer has been another sport that Atari kept screwing up on, and the 5200 version of Real Sports Soccer is further proof. The character animations are better, but the game runs so slowly that I can take a nap before the player reaches the other side of the pitch. I know soccer games tend not to have high scores, but that shouldn't be because the players are dragging their asses. Real Sports Tennis. Here's a case where the 2600 version of the game proves far superior to its 5200 brother. While the graphics and animations are improved quite a bit, it's near impossible to control the direction of your shots. Virtually every shot goes straight at the opponent. Even Pong provides more control than that. Saboteur. This prototype shooter revolves around trying to stop a rocket from launching. There's a nice variety of stages, each with its own quirks. While the controls could be tighter, and reading the manual is a must to understand what to do, I actually enjoyed this one. The graphics are colorful and varied, and the different types of stages kept me on my toes. Sea Battle. Space Attack. While a lot of M networks and television ports got shortchanged when put on the 2600, this one actually improves on the Intellivision version. The control on the radar is condensed to simple flicks of the joystick, and the shooter segments are faster and easier to control. This is definitely one of the best games brought over from the Intellivision. Star Raiders. While the 2600 version was pretty complex, the 5200 version sees the concept to its full potential. It can be a bit of a pain controlling everything from the radar to the hyperspace jumps, but it didn't take long to get used to it. While the graphics are drab compared to the game on the older console, I was sucked in by the level of control I had over my ship. It felt like an early blueprint for what Elite Dangerous would become. Star Strike. This attempt to recreate the trench run from the original Star Wars film sucks. It may look pretty good for a 2600 game, but it's way too easy to die. Despite numerous attempts, I've never been able to complete a round, and I'm way too annoyed to give a shit. Easy pass. Super Breakout. I wasn't enamored with the arcade or 2600 versions of this block-breaking fossil. The 5200 adds salt to the wound by providing controls that are way too slippery. I said it before, and I'll say it again. If you want to break blocks, just play Arkanoid. Super Challenge Baseball. Super Challenge Football. Sword Fight. Wizard. This shooter involves a wizard and an imp firing magic blasts at each other. Shots can only be made at close range, and the imp can pass through the walls of the maze while you can't. How is that fair? There are some neat ideas here for the time, but it just felt like this potion was prepared with some missing ingredients. Zari Arena. This is basically a battle version of a Breakout game. Controls can be slippery. There were several times that my paddle seemed to pass through the shots, and the super beam that you can activate once per round never seems to work. However, this is far more engaging than the other Breakout games in this collection, so I'll be generous. Yar's Return. Fans made a sequel to the awesome Yar's Revenge, and it's just nuts. As if dealing with random spirals and the homing missile from one direction wasn't nerve-wracking enough, now they're going in every direction from the center. Due to the new enemy placement, the game is a lot harder, but it's still as engaging as before. I still prefer the original, but this one's great too. Okay, Volume 3 is weaker than the other two volumes, but not by much. If this package wasn't stuffed with 9 multiplayer-only games, I'm sure the tally would have been better. This isn't a bad end to this collection, but it was a bit of a disappointment. So that's it for my look at the Atari Flashback Classics trilogy. Like this little blast from the past? Give a like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any other ideas for retrospectives, or just want to complain about the breaks from Outlaw Golf, drop them in the comments below or send them to that Twitter handle right there. Next time I'm starting the final tour of Outlaw Golf 2, and I've got the whips and handcuffs ready. Thanks for joining me, and game on.